Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Contra Mundum. This week entitled Semen est sanguis, or to give it the full quote, Semen est sanguis Christianorum, meaning, or generally paraphrased and translation as, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. This was a sentiment supposedly recorded by the 3rd century Christian Tertullian in his great tome, the Apology or Apologetics, wherein he was describing how despite the persecution of the early church, despite there being so many martyrs, yet the church still remained, and yet the church still grew. And the question that I'd like to pose and to reflect upon this evening is whether or not that sentiment of Tertullian still applies to today. More Christians in the 20th and 21st centuries have been martyred than in all the preceding centuries put together. It is estimated variously that 1 in 8 Christians suffer and experience persecution around the world. 1 in 8. And again, an average estimate is roughly that about 11 Christians a day are martyred for their faith. Some of you, of course, may be familiar. In my homily this morning, I'm afraid I got it wrong. It wasn't the British Home Office, but it was the British Foreign Office that commissioned a report into the state of Christian persecution across the world. And ultimately, the conclusion of the report was that the level of persecution of Christians globally was reaching genocidal proportions. Genocidal proportions. A few more statistics. So, as well as 8 Christians worldwide being killed because of their faith a day, every week 182 churches or Christian buildings are attacked. Every month 309 Christians are imprisoned unjustly. And these statistics are from the World Watch List 2020, which is the latest annual accounting from the charity Open Doors, which lists the top 50 countries where Christians are the most persecuted for their faith. The listed nations comprise 260 million Christians suffering high to severe levels of persecution. This is up from the preceding year of 245 million. 260 million. Another 50 million could be added from the 23 nations that fall just outside the top 50 list. This includes Mexico, Chad, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for a ratio of 1 in 8 on average Christians worldwide facing persecution. In 2019, 40 nations scored high enough to register as very high persecution levels. In 2020, it reached 45. Now, Open Doors has been monitoring Christian persecution worldwide since 1992. North Korea has ranked first since 2002, when the watch list began. The 2020 version tracks the time period from November the 1st, 2018 to October the 31st, 2019, and is compiled from reports by Open Doors workers in more than 60 countries. The list provides the most comprehensive grassroots data on Christian persecution. Last year, India entered the top 10 for the first time. The top 10 for the first time, while China rose from 43 to 27. And that trend continues. 2 in 5 Asian Christians now face high levels of persecution, up from 1 in 3. China's crackdown on both state-sanctioned and underground churches and its growing surveillance network adds another 16 million to Open Doors' tally of Christians facing persecution. To quote, "The Chinese government is committing unparalleled human rights crimes against Christian citizens and seeking to wipe religious sentiment from its country. Yet as the Chinese Christians who will testify, the persecution Christians face, including extensive surveillance, face recognition, by the way, surveillance, raids on churches and imprisonment, have not yet succeeded in eliminating Christianity. Instead, the underground Christian community has banded together and is actively working to call the world's attention to the plight of the Chinese people." The top 10 of those 50 countries this year are North Korea in first place, second place Afghanistan, followed by Somalia, Libya, Pakistan at number 5, Eritrea, Sudan, Yemen, Iran, and India this year at number 10. Just let those statistics and that information sink in for a moment. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Well, we do know, of course, that in the West, the church is in decline. But does Tertullian sentiment still have meaning in the 21st century? Well, yes, it does. A half dozen of those countries in the top 10 most persecuting of Christians are in Africa. And indeed, it is in Africa where the church is experiencing considerable growth. And so in one respect, it might be said that Tertullian sentiment still rings true. But we know, of course, that the church in the West is in decline. Why might that be so? Well, for all sorts of reasons, none of which are very good. Or rather, I should say, none of which reflect very well on the church in the West. Part of the problem is because many in the West don't perceive the persecution that the church is under. They don't appreciate the worldwide situation, let alone recognize the situation in their own countries, their own society, even within their own communities. Now, this picture describes both the direct and the indirect ways that persecution is meted out. Some of them, of course, might seem immediately obvious and relational to the various experiences of Christians in other places of the world. Arrests, imprisonment, torture, assassination and martyrdom, attacks on life and property, forced conversion, restrictions on churches and Bibles, crimes against women. These are, of course, a litany of abuses that we know go on in places in the Middle East and in Africa, in societies that are governed by another system of religion. Certainly, these are not things that we experience here in the West. But look at the indirect forms of persecution. Educational discrimination, job discrimination, denial of rights, legal restrictions. Now, these are experienced by Christians all over the world. In places where Christians are not regarded as full citizens, they are disadvantaged by not having access to education, not being preferred for employment, denial of various basic human rights as well as civil rights, things that so often we in the West take for granted, and various legal restrictions, where, for example, they are not permitted to gather, they're not permitted to meet together, they're not permitted to perform acts of public worship. In communist countries, for example, like Cuba, China, Vietnam, Laos, and North Korea, Christians are targeted because they vest, of course, their faith in the Lord and not in the Marxist regimes. Indeed, earlier this year, stories came out of China where Christian churches and homes were being forced to display pictures of the Communist Party chairman in place of Christ or a cross. We know, of course, the fundamentalist Islam is very intolerant toward other faiths, and in radical Muslim countries such as Egypt, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Indonesia, Christians suffer greatly. This suffering ranges from job discrimination up to the abduction, rape, and forced conversion of Christian women. Persecution is the most violent in these countries and often includes the imprisonment and murder, i.e., martyrdom of Christians. But Christian persecution also occurs as a result of social and cultural discrimination. In places like India, Christians are discriminated against, denied employment, physically attacked, and sometimes murdered, that is, martyred. Radical Islamic militant groups such as Boko Haram and the Fulani militants have decimated Christian communities throughout northern Nigeria. In the last 18 years, an estimated 50,000 to 70,000 Christians have been murdered by these two groups, while another 2 million have been displaced. We all, of course, remember ISIS that attacked viciously Christians throughout Iraq, displacing more than 100,000 Christians from their homes. ISIS militants executed many Christian men during their raids and kidnapped women and young girls and forced them into sexual slavery. 3 choices were offered by ISIS to Christians: convert to Islam, leave, or remain and pay a tax to live. Many families, of course, chose to leave. It is estimated that Christianity experiences 80% of religiously motivated discrimination globally. A century ago, 20% of the Middle East region's people were Christians. Today, the figure is below 5%. Now, perhaps in one respect, we might think to ourselves, well, we know about, those countries, those places in the world, particularly those countries run by fundamentalist, religionist governments, etc. And thank goodness we don't live there, so we haven't got to worry about those sorts of issues. But actually, let's just go back to this. True, the direct forms of persecution, as yet, on the whole, we don't experience in the West. But how many of us perceive the indirect discrimination that Christians are experiencing at the moment? Let's take, for example, job discrimination. We're all perhaps familiar with equality and diversity policies. Perhaps some of us are familiar with the Equalities Act of 2010 in the UK, wherein, of course, various categories of people are not allowed to be discriminated against. Except, it seems, those who practice or their Christian faith. We all know, for example, how outrageous it would be, and nigh impossible, to discriminate against a Muslim employee. For argument's sake, let's take a Muslim woman who wants to wear the hijab. And irrespective of usual uniform protocols in any given organization, an exception is always made for Muslim women to wear the hijab at work. No problem. No problem. Likewise, generally speaking, for a Sikh man, people would not discriminate against a Sikh man for wearing a turban. And yet, Christians are taken to court for wearing perhaps a cross lapel badge, for wearing a cross as a small piece of jewelry around their neck. We know that Christians have been taken to court for agreeing or offering to pray for people who have asked for their prayers. For example, a Christian nurse was taken to an employment tribunal for agreeing to pray for a patient. It seemingly didn't matter that the patient had asked for her prayers. The argument invariably being that this is some kind of religious indoctrination. That somehow we shouldn't bring our faith into the workplace. But that doesn't make sense, does it? If other religious believers are allowed, even encouraged, to wear distinctive costume from their culture and tradition, which clearly indicates their religious faith, how come that is allowed but is not allowed for Christians? Now, in the Equalities Act 2010, no difference is made between religions. No one is more favored than another. So why is it that invariably Christians are taken to employment tribunals for discreet, as it were, ways of manifesting their faith, whereas others are enabled, we might even say encouraged, to manifest or to indicate their faith? Indeed, many are facilitated. For example, in government offices, it's not unusual to find prayer rooms. These are being deliberately provided to enable particularly one faith practitioners to use. Likewise, human resources policies and employment legislation and practices encourage employers to act considerately toward members of a particular faith during their annual fast. Policies that encourage flexible ways of working to accommodate the times of fast during the day. But though other religions have similar practices, those are not facilitated. So these are just ways that discrimination is experienced indirectly in the West, in our places of work. Another form that perhaps again is less obvious, educational discrimination. Again, despite the fact that there are lots of policies, there are lots of guidance and guidelines that reinforce the concepts enshrined in the Equalities Act, even so, in subtle ways, those protections, as the Act describes them, are forgotten about in the application. If we take, for example, educational policies, the new relationships and sex education curriculum that is now being officially introduced as of this September into UK schools. Does not permit for a traditional perspective to be shared in the classroom. Indeed, various written guidance policies even suggest that pupils who express traditional cultural or religious views should receive special attention to persuade them to accept a more liberal or progressive perspective. Although the guidance from the Department of Education, and indeed the legislation, requires that parents be consulted on, for example, the ways in which the curriculum will be delivered in their local school and the resources and materials that will be used. Very few, in fact, have conducted any form of consultation with parents. Now, of course, it may be argued that because of the peculiar circumstances under COVID, and with all the various extra pressures that that has put upon teachers and pupils, and indeed parents alike, that aspect of the implementation has perhaps, been permitted to slide. But there's been no relaxation from the government upon the implementation of the curriculum. So that RSE classes are supposed to have been tabled and are supposed to be being delivered, and are being done so irrespective of whether any consultation with parents has taken place. Again, looking at the indirect denial of rights and legal restrictions. Well, here again, there are all sorts of insidious ways, meaning not obvious ways, meaning even more indirect than necessarily indirect suggests. The Christians have been and are discriminated against in the workplace and in the public sphere. For example, at the present time. And this, of course, is across the board. This is same for practitioners of all religions. But in the COVID lockdowns, all places of worship are closed. This by government legislation. Despite the fact that this is actually contrary to enshrined rights promised and guaranteed by various international accepted and recognized authorities, like, for example, the United Nations Charter on Human Rights, or the European Union Charter of Human Rights, or indeed the Equalities Act 2010 in the UK, where freedom of worship is an enshrined right. Freedom to express one's religion is an enshrined right. And in the various definitions, it is said, the freedom to worship, the freedom to pray, indeed the freedom to manifest one's faith. And little or none consultation was conducted by governments with the leaders of the various religions in their countries. Now, it's true that all have generally complied and acquiesced. And certainly here in the UK, we did so in the first lockdown. And then when the second lockdown was suggested, when the government announced finally they were going to impose a second lockdown, if there was a brief flurry of consultation, it happened in literally days before the lockdown was implemented. And one of the questions the religious leaders in this country asked the government for was the science, the scientific reason, the proof as to why religious places had to be shut down. Because incredibly, in the UK, certainly, no religious venue has been found to be the cause of any contagion or infection. None after the first lockdown, none in the intervening period, and none so far. And in large part because, of course, we kept to the regulations, we kept to the restrictions. And when we were allowed to gather in a limited way, We did everything to ensure that our people were safe and that our places were sanitized. And despite the National Office of Statistics publishing a list with the percentage risk rate ranging from supermarkets through to schools, through to public transport, the risk of infection, places of worship didn't figure. Didn't even register. And this imposition, despite the fact that at the same time, religious venues in this lockdown have been encouraged to continue providing various services, not religious services, but various support services, so that if your religious venue operates a food bank, that doesn't have to close, that can continue. If a nursery school or playgroup operates from a faith venue, that's allowed to continue. And of course, they are allowed to continue with all the various restrictions put in place: social distancing, wearing masks, sanitizing, washing hands, so on and so forth. Now, all that's allowed to go on in faith venues, except the very thing the faith venues are for, which is worship. And despite the fact that in the intervening period between the lockdowns, faith venues proved they could be trusted, no recorded contagions or infections directly attributable to worship services. And all faith venues were very, good at social distancing, sanitizing, so on and so forth. You know the drill. So despite the fact that we proved that we could worship safely, when it came to considerations for this lockdown, that wasn't given consideration. And yet everything else, all the other activities, can happen. And regarding, for example, nursery schools and playgroups and things, they can happen, but church youth groups can't. How is this not a form of religious discrimination? Where is the logic in these contradictions? You can operate a nursery school and a playgroup in a faith venue. And of course, children, and particularly very young children, are notoriously difficult to social distance. That's okay. But to allow ordinary members of the congregation to socially distance for worship, that is verboten. It doesn't make sense. And what else can we think but that? This is surely some kind of religious discrimination. Indirect, perhaps not immediately blatant, we might say, or obvious, but nonetheless it's there, isn't it? Why can we do everything else in our faith venues except the very thing for which they were built? Now, going back to our original question, do Tertullian's sentiments resonate, apply to today's situation? Well, certainly it does seem that in those places where, and despite the fact that Christians are persecuted, the church is growing. In Africa, even in China, even in Pakistan, even in India. Despite the difficulties, despite the crackdowns, despite the persecution, despite the murders, the violence, and the martyrdoms, the Christian population increases. In Africa, by something like 2% every year. But here in the West, and I think part of the reason for that is one of the questions perhaps we have to ask is, remember the words of St. Paul, where one suffers, all suffers, where one is glorified, all are glorified, describing that the mystical body of Christ. Though we are many, we are one body. So where one member suffers, we all suffer, etc. To be honest, I think part of the problem is that the church here in the West doesn't see itself, doesn't identify itself with the persecuted church elsewhere. Indeed, I don't know how many times I have heard Christians here in the West poo-poo the notion that the church is under any kind of persecution in the 21st century. Despite the statistics, despite the obvious evidence from elsewhere in the world, and part of the problem is they just do not identify themselves with the global church. And so we might say the benefit of the witness and testimony of those martyrs elsewhere is not realized here in the West. There is a shocking amount of apathy and ignorance. Most Christians here in the West have no idea that there is a global genocide of Christianity. Most Christians here in the West have no idea of the way in which Christians elsewhere are being persecuted, enduring persecution, and being murdered, executed, and martyred. We never hear, here in the West, we never hear the statistics, we never hear the testimonies, we never hear the stories. We don't know the names. Most Christians here in the West will not be able to tell you where in the world acute persecution is going on. They might perhaps have a broad idea, but generally not. They certainly wouldn't be able to name countries. Let alone the names of any of the martyrs. Christians in the West just don't talk about contemporary martyrdom. One of the reasons why 2,000 years later, or several thousand, or several hundred years later, every day at Mass, we commemorate and remember some saint, martyr or confessor. It's because when those saints lived, and even when those saints had died, the Christians kept their names and told their stories. They shared the news of the witness the Christians were making. And they purposely remembered the names. When was the last time you here, in the West, when was the last time you heard anybody talk about a contemporary martyr by name and retell their story? And this is what I mean by apathy and ignorance, and by not identifying with the church elsewhere. So that's part of the reason, that's part of the problem, that the church in the West is dying. I could give you statistics, but to be honest, they're so depressing. But everybody knows it. We all know it anecdotally. Churches and chapels are closing all the time. Congregations are dwindling all the time. We know this. The other part of the equation is the confusion in or amongst Christians in the West as to what the faith is, as to what constitutes the Christian faith. Forgetting for a moment the kind of usual traditional cultural differences between denominations, most Christians today don't actually know their faith. They're not familiar with the scriptures, they're not familiar with the central dogmas. And most of those who should know better themselves profess and believe and teach all sorts of erroneous doctrine. So that the church in the West, and when I say the church, I mean all Christians, the church in the West is mostly apostate, is mostly heretical. People believing in false doctrines like universalism, old heresies in new forms like Arianism, dualism, Gnosticism. So what Christians there are here in the West, A, don't identify with other Christians globally, are ignorant of what's happening to them, and B, don't really know the Christian faith themselves. And which is why the church here in the West does not give an effective witness. combined with a heavy dose of apathy, and comfortableness, that's why the church in the West is declining. As I said in my homily this morning, ask yourself, when was the last time you saw a group of Christians protesting about Christian genocide, about the mistreatment of Christians in any given place anywhere? Where in the West have you seen Christians protest? Where have you seen Christians protest to governments or demand that their governments do something about those countries who blatantly are abusing civil rights and liberties and enshrined freedoms? See, that's the level of apathy there is in the Western church today. What's the solution? Well, the solution is those of us who recognize and understand the situation do something about it. That we make a point of talking about and identifying ourselves with the persecuted church. That we sign up and make a point of researching the charities like Open Doors, like Persecution, International Christian Concern, like Aid to the Church in Need, research. And you can find incredible resources from these charities, which will give you concrete, not just anecdotal, but concrete evidence, eyewitness accounts of martyrdoms and persecutions and of the ways in which Christians are living persecution in these other places of the world. Their pain should be our pain. And we should know the glory they give to God by their testimonies, by their witness, by their martyrdoms. We should know that. We should know their names. We should be sharing amongst ourselves their stories. We should be talking about and describing to family, friends, relations, colleagues. Do you realize what Christians are going through in such and such? Because one of the questions that will obviously be prompted, not necessarily directly expressed, but certainly prompted in most people's minds in the West would be, well, why would anyone be a martyr for Christianity? And that would give the opportunity for us as Christians to then talk about our love for Christ. People will be naturally curious and drawn to know why Christians in these places don't just give up Christianity for the sake of their lives. You see how by identifying ourselves with the persecuted church, indeed the blood of the martyrs would then indeed sow the seeds for revitalization and evangelism, even here in the West. And how heart speaks unto heart by simply sharing and talking about the human stories, just as Christians did centuries ago, which is why we still remember today obscure saints from the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, where we have now only the briefest details sometimes, just the core kernel of their witness. But we have the fact that we have that is because at one time Christians talked, shared and shared and shared the story of the legend of the witness of Saint so-and-so. And this is what we should be doing again today. We who know this, we who recognize this, you who have heard this now from me, I warn you, you are now admonished to do something about it, or not do something about it and take the consequences. To see your church, your congregation dwindle to nothing. It is possible. It is possible to turn things around, but it requires those of us who know to make a point of doing it. So please, I encourage all of you who are Christians, research, identify yourself in Christ with those who are suffering for Christ elsewhere in the world. Try to learn some names. Try to learn the witnesses and the testimonies. Try to learn the situations, the circumstances in which Christians are enduring persecution and being martyred, and share it. Talk about it with others. And we just might, my brothers and sisters, be able to renew and refresh and revive the church in the West. We just might be able to share in the benefit of the witness of those martyrs elsewhere. To make Tertullian's observation still relevant to today. Contra Mundum, Semen est sanguis, Christianorum. Bless you. Thank you for watching. Next broadcast, of course, will be tomorrow's Mass at 8:30. Tomorrow evening, of course, is Old Romans Unscripted. So do tune in for that, 6:30 p.m. GMT. Meanwhile, God bless you. Take care, and remember, God loves you.